I have here today with me Ric Thorpe from the UK, and Ric is the Bishop of Islington, which is also another term for the Bishop of Church Planting for the Anglicans in London in particular, but also across Britain. Ric, fantastic that you can come and join us today. I really appreciate you doing so. So thank you for that.
Now, thank you. It's great to be with you, Tim.
Ric, just to start off, I've just loved your book, Resource Churches, and I understand that came out of the doctoral study that you were doing, and you ended up writing a book as a result. And I think the doctoral study came as a result of an experience you had some time ago when you drew a map of Britain from memory from reading your book, and you drew crosses all over the map. Before you describe what a resource church is, would you mind just explaining what happened at that time?
Yeah, so first of all, great to be with you, Tim. Thank you for this time. I was on a learning community with some of the team from Holy Trinity Brompton, and I'd already planted a church from there, and I was just beginning to reflect on church planting and training church planters. And so there were four of us, and we were just about to, or HTB was just about to plant its first church outside London. And we began to start thinking, gosh, if we could have more opportunities to plant all over the country, then I wonder what would happen. And so this learning community was about multiplying church planting as a concept. And so we were encouraged to make a plan. And actually, it wasn't me, it was Miles Tillman, who's now leading a church in Kuala Lumpur, which was planted from Holy Trinity Brompton. And we drew this map, and we said, look, if we're in London, if we planted to Brighton, which was the first plant, so we just literally drew a cross of a church at in Brighton, and then we thought, what if that church went on to plant? So we then drew another arrow across the coast, and then we had a few arrows from there. And then we thought, well, what about other parts of the country? So Birmingham, Manchester, and we just drew all these cities, and literally just saying, what if we planted to those places, and then they planted to other places, and then they planted again? And so we were imagining not just reproduction on a larger canvas, so not just in London, which is where HTB had planted before, but actually beginning to say, what's stopping us from planting elsewhere? Just because it hasn't been done before, we could do it, and we were just about to do it. So that phase. And then the interesting thing for us was, what might it look like if the church plants planted churches as well? And that began to get a whole, well, it took us on a journey really of multiplication that, looking back after 10 years, it's an extraordinary thing where we've just seen Holy Trinity's plants, they've planted probably between the immediate plants and then their grandchildren and great-grandchildren of planting, they've got something like 80, 90 churches that they're responsible for in terms of a network. And we are also seeing other churches beginning to start saying, actually, we could do this as well. And this is in a historic denomination. You kind of, it raises loads of questions. And really that was at the heart of the Resource Church book, was saying, and the research, the research was effectively saying, how can we make this happen in an institution that's not geared up for this kind of thing? And we began to start saying, what are the things what are the blockers, what are the enablers to be able to see that? And then
that's great.
So
tell us, what is a resource church?
Yeah, so a resource church is it's effectively, it's normally based in a city centre, and it is a church planting church that works within the structures of the denomination strategically, to be able to not just grow itself, but also to start revitalizing or planting new churches, revitalizing old churches or planting new ones, and doing that at scale, so that it begins to address one of the problems that we have in our cities, which is that in our denomination, the Christian faith in our cities is going down, whereas but it's stronger in rural areas. And we're saying, well, we've neglected cities, so we need to go back into cities. We need to plant churches or revitalize churches back in the cities, strengthen them, and then make them into effectively church planting factories that will just keep on planting and planting and planting. And so it's beginning to go, okay, a resource church is designed, it's almost like it's infected with the DNA to be able to multiply from the very beginning, and work within the structures, where the structures have been set up to resist change. Because if you like, in a historic denomination that's been around for 1500 years, we're trying to sustain ourselves. If you do anything new, it's often resisted. And so this is saying, how can we do this in such a way that it's not resisted? It fits within the structures, but it's able to bring new life, new energy, with church planting and revitalization at its heart.
That's great. So from what I understand, a resource church, there are two different flows of resources. There's a flow into the church, and then there's a flow out of the church. Is that correct? And if that's
the case, the way,
could you explain that?
So how it works? Yeah, so how it works is that the expectation of a resource church is that it will resource others. So in some cases, some churches have said, we don't want to call it a resource church, we want to call it a resourcing church, to really have that in mind. It's not going to suck the resources out of everywhere else. It's going to be giving resource away. So the way that works in practice is that you would send a leader, an ordained leader, with a team to another place and either revitalize it or start a new church. And you would, that flow is outward to resource the wider church, to resource an area strategically. But when we realize that there are churches that have the capacity and vision to do that, if you want to accelerate that process, you can resource them. And so the principal way that dioceses, which are kind of regional collections of churches, the principal ways that dioceses are doing that is to say, let's give you ordained leaders. We will help to pay for that, so that you can send them with people from your congregations to start new churches or revitalize old ones. So that flow, the flow in is the denomination supporting the leadership development process, sending good leaders, paying for that process. So alleviating that cost from the resource church. But then the resource church will flow outwards in terms of sending teams and those leaders elsewhere.
So the blessing flowing is both people and provision, with the expectation that that flows out as well.
Yes, I mean, the people coming in are it would typically be an assistant pastor. So someone who has been appointed to learn how to plant in the sending church, in the resource church, but also adding capacity to the resource church as well, so that they can grow even more. But that would be the inflow of people. But the outflow is both that same leader would then go out, but they would take the congregation, members of the congregation with them who are part of the planting team. And so there's a kind of a net generosity from the resource church itself.
So as part of the planting out, how important is it that the church plant takes someone with them who is likely to be able to plant another church? Does that happen, or do you then look for another planter once you've been planted?
So then I think the sooner you have what we call an apprentice planter, or a planting intern, or a planting curate. So curate is an assistant minister. If you have someone who's doing that, their expectation, particularly if it's within their title, their expectation is that they're going to plant. And so the sooner you have them in your church, in your resource church, the sooner you're going to be planting churches. And so some churches don't start with a planting intern, but if they're going to plant a church, they have to do it really within 5 years. Otherwise, it's unlikely that they will plant easily. But we're finding that to really almost like put the sign on the bus that we're not just planting a church, we're planting a church planting church. We say right from the beginning, you've got a lead planter and an assistant planter or an apprentice planter, and they are helping the existing church to grow and to develop and so on, but also they're learning how to plant as they go, so that in 1, 2, or 3 years they can then take a team themselves and plant themselves. So we're saying right really from the get-go, we want to be a resource church is to have a planting apprentice on your team. And so right from the start, you're going to have to do it. And that helps the resource church itself, but also helps the hierarchy to say, we are going to use this church to plant churches. And so it has a kind of a double impact.
No, that's great. So you're setting the DNA and the expectations and the strategy all at once effectively. So tell me, is this the concept of resource churches, is this a new concept, or is it just really putting a framework around something that's been happening over the years? What's the historical background to this?
So there is, we do have models of this that go back a long way in our history. So in the medieval period, which is the 7th to the 10th century AD, a lot of the churches that were established were called minster churches. So these were from the Gregorian mission. So Pope Gregory sent Augustine in the 6th century, 597 AD, to England, and he got permission from the king at the time to build a church in Canterbury, and that church really, it's now a cathedral, but it was like a minster, and a minster church was one that was a center of excellence. It was a center where leaders were developed and resources were grown. And in terms of studying, they had their scriptoriums, which were the places where they did the beautiful writing and documents and so on that were written, and beautiful drawings around them. And so there was a whole culture of learning around these places, but also they were centers of mission, because they would have monks who would go out on mission to do evangelism in local towns and villages. And when there was a response to the gospel, one of those monks would be associated with that particular place. They would build a wooden church where people would gather. And once that church was established, the monk would then live in that place. And so these minster churches were church planting churches. They were doing mission in a wider area, planting churches with these monks. And then our history is that those churches, if they had that same DNA, they would then plant to from the towns to the villages. And so these minster churches were known as places of resource and giving away that resource to the mission and evangelism of a whole region. And so that's part of our history. And it was only once literally hundreds and thousands of churches were planted from those that there was more of a stabilizing of churches in the country, so that the minster churches then began to just, they became known as greater churches. So these were just larger churches, well resourced in terms of staffing, but they'd stopped planting churches, after 3 or 4 centuries. What we've done really with resource churches is to recapture some of the DNA of that, because a lot of those city centre churches where they were originally established have really gone to very, very low numbers. And we've lost the ability to grow large churches in cities. We see it in other denominations. We see it in particularly new churches and Pentecostal churches and so on, where they have understood in our generation how to grow large churches in cities. And we're saying, well, as a denomination, let's learn from them, but also learn from our history and recover some of them. And that's really helpful in the denomination to say, if it's been done before, then there's nothing stopping us really from doing it again.
No, that's good.
So minster churches are part of our DNA.
As you're talking about that, it was reminding me of Revelations 2, I think it is, with one of the churches there. I can't off the top of my head recall which one, but the command was to go back to doing the things that you've done. You did it first, and your work isn't finished. You need to recapture that, and that's exactly what you're doing.
And of course, that's the wonderful thing about those churches in Revelation 2 and 3 is that they were planted by from Ephesus.
That's right.
Which was part of the third. They were all planted on that third mission journey, and Paul didn't actually physically plant any of them himself. They were planted by others like Epaphras. And so, again, just going back to scripture with a new lens of saying, how might church planting churches operate? And we see in Acts 19 and Acts 20 and just some hints from the rest of the New Testament, we see Paul developing leaders who were sent to plant churches. And because they must have had that DNA of planting churches, because whole regions are, well, Acts 19 verse 10, all Asia, both Jews and Greeks, have heard the gospel.
And that was
So
likely to be about 4 million
through
people
church.
at the time. That region was likely to be about 4 million people at the time, which is roughly of a population of the state of Victoria in Australia.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah,
Interesting.
and that was before social media and Zoom and mobile phones and every modern transport, but amazingly effective. So, in the work that you're doing with the resource churches over the last 10 years, how many resource churches have been developed?
Yeah. So, in 2009, I talked about Brighton. St. Peter's Brighton was the first one from Holy Trinity. So we think there were about 3 or 4 resource churches in 2009, HTB being one of them. St. Peter's became one over time. So, and there were a couple of others that were doing significant church planting around the country. Now there are over 100 of these churches. In 2013, I worked with someone in the central structures to set a goal where we said, look, let's try and create 100 resource churches by 2025. And we actually hit that target in 2020 because we've been intentional about creating these, working with bishops to see them appointed, and working with those who would be church leaders who would either be able to plant them, create them from scratch, or to repurpose an existing larger church to become a church planting church. And so these 2 different models, these 2 different ways of creating resource churches are now in place. And we've been clear with bishops to say, don't call a resource church just because it wants to be known as that, or you feel you want it to be known as that. You need to be able to say, if it's a resource church, just to keep the bar high, it has to be a church planting church. So don't call it a resource church until you've either given it a church planting intern, or it's actually started planting churches itself.
That's
so
great.
We've got 100 which have badged like that around the country now.
Across those 100 resource churches, is there a common average goal as to how many church plants they want to see born? Is it one plant a year per church, or?
Yeah, there's no consistency, but I think what we're trying to say is that using existing structures, we would love to see 3 or 4 over a 10-year period as a minimum. So the way that we get to that number is because a curacy, so that's like an assistant pastor appointment, is in the Church of England is typically 3 years. And so if a resource church takes on a planting curate, they'll be there for 3 years. That person would then plant, and then the resource church would take on another planting curate, and then they would plant, and then another one. And so you get 3 or 4 over a 10-year period. But our experience impacts that in 2 ways. One is that once a church has planted 2 or 3 churches, they want to accelerate their church planting, because they're starting to say, we could do this quicker, we could do this cheaper, we could do this, we're learning how to do this at scale. But the other one is that by infecting the DNA of that planter, by saying you're not just going to plant a church with a planting curate, let the planting curate take on another apprentice planter, then they can go on to plant. So you then get multiplication built in. And so all we can do is look at churches like St. Peter's Brighton and say, well, what's happened there? So in 2009, they reopened a closed church in the centre of Brighton. They've grown as a church to over 1,000 people, which is, in our context in the Anglican Church, that's one of the top 10 churches, really. So it's grown fast in 10 years. But they have now planted about 6 churches, I think, and some of those churches have gone on to plant others. I just heard yesterday that one of their church plants to St. John's Crawley has a plan to plant 4 churches that are being supported by the diocese. They're enabling opportunities for that to happen. So St. Peter's also planted a church in Portsmouth that is called Harbour Church, and that church has gone on to plant 4 churches just in the last 5 years, and some of those churches are planting on. So we're seeing multiplication happen from these at a faster rate than just the 3 or 4 in the next 10 years. So
that's great.
It's difficult to predict.
Yeah, Rick, I was inspired to read about Harbour Church, about their innovative way of solving the problem of not having the right spaces to meet in. As I understand, they started in a department store, an old department store, but that was expensive to make it really work. But then it spread out to different locations where there are already different churches. Can you just unpack that a little bit for us? Because for me, that's a paradigm change.
Yeah, it really is. So for us, the paradigm change was actually using a department store at all. So for many churches that are not part of a denomination, they would say, well, what is the space available?
Yeah.
And for us, I say it's a paradigm shift because we have loads. I mean, we've got 16,000 church buildings in the Church of England, and a lot of them are have very few people in them. So our way of thinking is, let's use what's already there. And we're kind of quite blinkered with the way we think about that. You know, of course, we'd use a Church of England church building, even if it's going to cost a fortune to run and sustain. But when there was no building available in Portsmouth, but the bishop still wanted to have this church plant come, because, you know, when I talk about that growth at St. Peter's, one of the things that we're noticing with resource churches is they're reaching different demographics to what we normally reach. They're reaching younger, they're reaching students who are the most underreached group in the country, and they're reaching young families. And so this has been really significant for us in terms of getting fast investment in these churches because of the people they're reaching and because they're growing. But so they said, what's available? And it was an old department store, which was a 3-story building. It had been closed, and they were renting it and refurbishing it. But after 2 years, they'd outgrown that space. They'd grown to over 300 people. And so they were given 2 churches that were really, really small in terms of membership. And the diocese didn't know what to do with these 2 churches. They said, we're going to have to close them, but could you do something with them? And they said, absolutely, yes. They were in 2 different parts of Portsmouth. And so they sent a team to one, St. George's, and another one to, I can't remember the name of the church, in Portsea it is, and one in Copner, which is another area. And within 6 months, the church had doubled in size. So they'd grown to 300 more people just by using those 2 spaces. And again, similar demographic. But one of the things they found was that, in particular in the Copner plant, which is in quite a poor area, they were reaching people that have never been to church ever, and part of a different demographic of people, much more working class people who would never normally go to church in our context. And what happened then was, okay, they're revitalizing these church buildings, and just very recently, the church next door to the department store has just became available. There was a vacancy, and before the diocese wasn't able to use that building, and they said, would you like to use this building? They said, absolutely, we don't need to pay loads of rent for this space, and we can take over this existing church building. So as much as possible, they will use church buildings, but it's almost like something's been broken in terms of an addiction to using our existing buildings, if it's at all possible. So Gas Street in Birmingham is another example where they took an old warehouse that was part of the gasworks of the city. And so it's this beautiful old red brick building with kind of wrought iron structures in the roof. And so it's quite kind of iconic and beautiful actually as a building, but it's not a church. And they consecrated it as a space, they developed it, and now that church has close to 900 members.
Yeah.
That was planted in 2015, something something like that. So we're seeing quite an excitement around using non-church buildings if there's none available. So we're no longer bound by, oh, we have to wait for a church to become available. No, we can use any space. If we're determined strategically to say we need a church in this place, we'll learn from our brothers and sisters in different denominations and say, let's just find the right space for us and then work from there and not be bound to that space, but to preach the gospel afresh in that place.
That's great. Now, as I was reading your book, and whilst it's couched in Anglican terminology, I could see how really it's, because you were writing it about that particular scenario, that the principles are just so transferable. And I was just thinking, our nation, Australia, needs resource churches. I know of a couple of churches across our country which I would genuinely say are resource churches without necessarily having had that terminology. But really every denomination and movement needs to have resource churches that are being set up across our country. Ric, we need to finish up the interview soon. But just one last question that I'd like to ask you. What are you learning through resource churches? Are there any particular learnings that you'd like to just pass on to us before we finish?
So a number of things. First of all, becoming strategic in church planting. So I think before we've been quite opportunistic. We've just seen, there's a church which is wanting to do it and they take the opportunity, and in our denomination permission was given, and it was sparse and a few churches were doing it. We then became intentional. So we started setting goals like that, number of resource churches. What we've learned is that that's an important step, but there's another step, which is being strategic, where you're then saying, where should we be planting churches? So it's saying not where are the opportunities, where is it easiest to do it, but actually what about whole areas where there are unchurched people? What about regions of cities that have been neglected? Resource churches are churches that are strategically minded, because they're not just planting one church, they're planting lots of churches over a period of time, and they can start saying, where are we going to do that in such a way that it's going to have as big an impact as possible? So that's the first thing, becoming strategic. The second thing is that I'd say that we're seeing that it's an important part of the mix of churches. Not every church should be a resource church, but every church can be a church planting church. So a small church of 50 can plant, can send a team of 5 or 10 people to start a new church somewhere else. Actually, a church of 12 could plant, send 2 people to start another, cell church. So, but what we're finding is the resource churches become almost like iconic. They are a symbol of both the church recovering ground in the city, which is important. They are growing larger and younger, and they become something where others can say, they're doing it, can we join in with that? And we don't want every church to be a resource church, because we want to affirm different kinds of churches across the mix. The nation, a city, needs all kinds of churches to reach different kinds of people. So a resource church is a key part of the mix of that. So that's another thing. And I think the other thing is the whole intentionality around developing leaders. So if you want to be a church planting church, you need to get your leadership pipeline structured well. And what that means in practice is to say, if you draw a timeline and just say, how many churches do we want to plant in the future? You might do that on a map as well. And then you track back and say, well, when are we going to recruit those people? And you begin to add that up. You begin to say, we need to have a recruitment of excellent leaders who feel called to do this and are capable of doing this. But also we need to develop them and train them in such a way that they're going to be able to do what we want them to do, which is to plant churches that plant churches. And so Resource Church becomes a place where that thinking is completely normal. And it doesn't mean that they're the only people doing it, but they might focus their training and actually resource others by giving away their training so that other people can start doing it as well. I guess a final thing I'd say is around the whole thing of networking churches together. So a denomination works hierarchically. So I always think of it as almost like an x-axis, whereas, a y-axis.
Yeah.
It's structures, it's top-down, it's useful for many things, legal structures, safeguarding, accountability, and so on. A network is horizontal, it's flat. It's more like the x-axis. It's a network of relationships who are committed to a common vision.
Yep.
Resource churches are able to network their churches together in a flat way that doesn't threaten the denomination at all. And we're finding that resource churches are, with the churches they plant, they're able to strengthen themselves by having a network where they can share leaders, they can share learning, they can share resources, and really take the opportunities of scale that enables. And in a denominational structure where everything is normally provided by the hierarchy, this actually relieves the hierarchy from some of that, and it is much more fit for purpose. And so there are a whole range of different things that we're learning. And I think that's where, you're saying about other denominations, it can apply to any group of churches where they're just beginning to say, could we have a few churches which are almost these church planting factories that are like the church in Ephesus, like the church in Antioch, that are just planting churches that plant churches that plant churches that complement the other churches that are in the mix. And I think that they have a huge part to play, not just in the Anglican Church, but in any denomination or any group of churches.
That's fantastic. I think as you were talking about the horizontal axis, I thought that was a great description, actually. And really what you're describing was an apostolic network, a relational network that was actually developing, rather than the hierarchical structure, which comes through the power structures. And I think that's a tremendous picture that you've just painted there, Ric. I really appreciate you doing that. Ric, again, I just want to thank you for writing that book, Resource Churches. I'm going to put it on the screen at the end of the interview so people can have a good look at it. And of course, I want people to do more than have a good look at it. I want them to acquire it and to read it and to put it into practice, because I think this is one of the strategies that here in Australia that our country desperately needs. We talk about church planning. We've got a lot of thoughts about church planning, a lot of desire to be planting churches. But this is one of those strategies that can actually take vision into action. And I think it could be absolutely key for our nation. So, Ric, again, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks.
And really appreciate your wisdom and your willingness to help.
It's a pleasure, and blessings on Australia. We love you. We are right behind everything you're doing. So go for it.
Okay. Thanks, Ric.